are we really, for example, going to be in a situation where we are going to send people to countries where we know they might be killed? Are we going to send children back? And Farage himself said, actually, we're not too sure what we're going to do about kids. What are we going to do? He says that we're going to exert diplomatic or economic leverage on Afghanistan. What economic or diplomatic leverage on Afghanistan? Are we going to pay money to the Taliban, which we think is a terrorist organisation? Is that seriously what we're going to do?
There is absolutely rightly a concern that, if you are a nation, you have to control who comes into your country. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. It's what is the right thing to do. And the right thing to do is bloody complicated. It's Jon.
It's Lewis. And this is a speech that Reform have been promising for much of the summer. It was trailed in the papers at the weekend. Farage and Reform once again showing they are very adroit, very adept at being able to control the media conversation, particularly when the government itself, for reasons much to our bemusement, I think, Jon, have decided to basically be quiet about much and about pretty much everything this summer. But yeah, Farage made this big speech flanked by his chairman, Zia Youssef, in Oxford this morning. And it was meaty, I think it's fair to say. Here are some of the things that he's promised as part of his deportation plan. He wants to deport over 500,000 people, 600,000 people. In order to do that, he's saying he will quit all foreign treaties used to prevent deportations by lawyers. That would include our membership of the European Convention of Human Rights. It would be the disapplication, at the very least, of the UN Convention on Torture and Treaty on Torture. Likewise, the disapplication, if not the outright removal, of the Human Rights Act within UK law. He said that anyone who arrives illegally will be entirely ineligible to claim asylum. He said that those who do arrive will be detained in camps, including women and children who enter the country illegally. He said the RAF Voyager is on standby. It's hardly clear for what, but it's going to be on standby. Sweeping detention power to the Home Secretary. Has promised a returns agreement with Albania, although we already have one, and will launch threats to countries who refuse return treaties with the UK, including cuts in foreign aid and maybe economic sanctions, so countries like Eritrea, Afghanistan, and so on. And he's rejected concerns about what happens to asylum seekers after deportation, like if they're going to get tortured or killed or whatever, because he says we've got bigger problems in our own country. And we have to see off the threat of civil unrest, which he's been predicting all summer.
Yes, that threat of civil unrest is the really interesting bit for me. The quote, in fact, I think there is now, as a result of this, a genuine threat to public order, and that is the very last thing we want. And you think, is it actually the last thing you want, or is it a fantastic recruiting sergeant for Reform if there is some unrest? I mean, you look at the last summer riots, and Reform rose fantastically off the back of that, summer riots over... Again, it was over immigration and asylum seekers and all the rest. And, the spark may have been the Southport murders, but it morphed into something very different. And you can see how Nigel Farage is very cleverly and, as you say, adroitly playing this. I watched the speech this morning. The backdrop, it felt prime ministerial. It felt like he had the full panoply. There were autocue, there was a big audience in a big kind of old aircraft hangar. It could have been a Tory launch, it could have been a Labour launch. This was Reform doing big style politics. And even if you start unpicking and looking into the detail of, but if we do that, what happens to the Good Friday Agreement? And if we do that, how are you going to get Afghan asylum seekers back to Afghanistan or wherever it happens to be? The general impression given is that I've got a plan, conventional politics has failed, come to me because I'm the only one who will get this done.
Well, we should maybe separate it because we can talk about the politics, because I agree with you. The politics is clearly on his side. Let's just talk about, though, some of the things he said and some of his ideas, because I think it is important, because he's coming along and saying that this is novel, and this is comprehensive. And in fact, he guaranteed, he's the latest in a long line of politicians now who've said, if we do my plan, this problem will go away. So let's just take a little bit of it in turn. First of all, as you say, Jon, he says, I think there's a growing threat to our public order, and that's the last thing we want. Well, is it? Because maybe not Farage directly, although he has a bit, but the wider online right all summer has basically been predicting that this country is about to take to the streets, is about to go out, and is about to end up in profound civil disorder because of this issue. I'm not saying that there isn't profound feeling in this country about this issue. I know that there is. But I will just note that even this weekend, again, when there were predictions of mass disorder, actually in most cases, it's a bit of a damp squib. In most cases, people just went about and were enjoying their bank holiday weekend, and there was not civil disorder. And I have to say that I think politicians have to be very, very careful about predicting and using the threat of civil disorder or the prospect of civil disorder in order to say we must do this policy. I'm sorry, we live in a parliamentary democracy here. We don't live under the force of we don't live under the force of vigilante justice. We don't live under the threat of the mob. That's not how we do politics in this country. Again, I'm not seeking to undermine the strength of feeling that's out there. There is a very strong strength of feeling out there for reasons that I understand. But I also think that most British people, most reasonable British people, are not going to be taking to the streets and trying to venting their anger in that way. They may do so at the ballot box, and Reform is clearly riding a bit of a wave at the moment. But I am very, very uncomfortable about senior political figures saying, if we don't do this, we're going to have violence on the streets. Imagine if a left-wing force did that. It would rightly be decried and slammed as basically the fomentation of a kind of street justice and a street politics and a violence of the streets. We can't be going in that direction.
No, I think that's so true. I remember kind of when I first started out in journalism, and you were given a test, and police are predicting disorder or whatever. Politicians say there will be disorder this weekend when protesters come together, and you think, no, if there is disorder, we'll report it. But let's not predict, and let's not make it a self-fulfilling prophecy that there is going to be violence on the streets. And actually this summer, you go back to this time last year when you had Elon Musk kind of weighing in, and he's kind of weighed in slightly today, but we'll come to that, weighing in and saying civil war is coming to Britain. It's a certainty. Well, it hasn't, and it probably isn't. And for the 100 or so people who are outside whichever hotel housing asylum seekers, there is probably another 500 or 1,000 who feel very strongly about it who aren't there. But there are millions of people who are going about their daily lives who are not part of this protest movement. There is absolutely rightly a concern that, if you are a nation, you have to control who comes into your country. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. It's what is the right thing to do. And the right thing to do is bloody complicated. If there were an easy answer to this, don't you think the Tories would have found it? Don't you think Keir Starmer would have found it? And just to hold up, right, we've got this idea, we're just going to expel them all. I mean, for Donald Trump, it is slightly easier because everyone is coming across the southern border, from Mexico. And you can just say, right, well, you're going back to Mexico, or you're going back to, this Supermax prison in El Salvador. Slightly easier than for us. What are we going to do practically?
Yeah, indeed. And something that Farage was talking about is, maximising our economic and diplomatic muscle. And again, citing the Trump example. And we should say, Trump has had a lot of success in dealing with the situation on the southern border. He's closed most of the asylum programs. He's doing it at an extraordinary social cost, you could argue. Being in the United States recently, we've both been, you see huge protests against ICE, massive social division, the threat of ICE going into communities and deporting, in some cases, American citizens or spouses of American citizens or fathers or mothers of American citizens. So, it's been extremely heavy-handed and in many cases unconstitutional, but there is no doubt that he's had some success. Very hard, much harder to replicate that in our case for all sorts of different reasons we can discuss, not least because something Trump can do, because he's the president of the United States, is exert substantial political and economic pressure on Mexico. We do not enjoy that same political and economic leverage with France. France and Britain are roughly similar-sized economies with similar-sized powers within Europe. We can't threaten sanctions on France. None of this would work, right? It's not replicable. And the geography, of course, is completely different. And then there's the legal framework. Farage is right that our legal framework has made it more difficult for the Home Office than, say, ICE or the United States government to do what it wants. But then there are sometimes good reasons for that, right? For a start, this question, which I have not heard anyone provide a satisfactory answer to, and you've already alluded to it, John, is like, what are we going to do about the Good Friday Agreement? The fact is the ECHR is written in which is the Good Friday Agreement. It would require a revision, which Farage says he's going to do. He says that a Reform government will be able to achieve a revision, opening up the Good Friday Agreement with the Republic, right? Well, good luck with that.
Good luck with that.
Good luck with that. And not only good luck with that, but is that what we want? Do we want, after a period of dicey period in relations, Anglo-Irish relations, and indeed in terms of the peace process, do we want to be reopening the Good Friday Agreement? Likewise, you and I have discussed, I think that it is time, and I think there is general recognition, and I think that, you know, the window has moved on this. I think there is more and more recognition across Europe that we might need to look at the post-Second World War refugee architecture, the legal architecture. Yeah, we might need to look at the ECHR, but there's a difference between that and just saying, right, we're going to disapply it. We're going to remove it from UK law. We're going to leave it unilaterally. These are difficult things. Are we really, for example, going to be in a situation where we are going to send people to countries where we know they might be killed? Are we going to send children back? And Farage himself said, actually, we're not too sure what we're going to do about kids. What are we going to do? He says that we're going to exert diplomatic or economic leverage on Afghanistan. What economic or diplomatic leverage on Afghanistan? Are we going to pay? Are we going to pay money to the Taliban government?
Yes.
For them to take. Okay, we're going to give money to the Taliban, which we think is a terrorist organisation. Is that seriously what we're going to do? Okay, it's a decision, but let's have that discussion because it is very, very. The actual trade-offs on it are substantial.
Yeah, and you know, I don't know what can we threaten the Taliban with? I mean, sanctions on what?
Well, we're doing a lot of trade, obviously, with the Afghans at the moment.
Exactly. So it's sort of, you know, but that's not what Nigel Farage is after. Nigel Farage is about doing really, really well at the next election. And whether his policies will work or not is almost incidental to his central aim of to keep riding this political wave. And I have to say, he is riding this wave brilliantly. There is genuine concern out there. I think that people are right to be concerned about illegal immigration. And a lot of what he says in terms of the frustrations felt by the British people, even if he overcooks it slightly and saying, you know, there could be civil disorder, I think he's right. I think there are an awful lot of people who think this is just monstrous that all these small boats are arriving and people, you know, probably a lot of them, you know, not genuine asylum seekers, probably kind of economic migrants who are looking for work and hoping, you know, there are so many other things as well that could be done in terms of identity cards and all sorts of things that could be done. But at the moment, you know, let's turn this back on the Labour government. I don't see the radical thinking coming. You know, I saw in the
They've
Times...
said nothing all summer.
The
They've
Times
allowed
today,
them to occupy
they
this
may have
space.
identified 100 asylum seekers who arrived on small boats to go back to France. And you think, okay, it's a start, but it's not very much, is it, when you're talking about thousands of people arriving? And so I just think that at the moment the government doesn't seem to be... either is paralysed and can't find a good policy solution that's workable and practicable, or it's just not thinking about it. And if it's not thinking about it, it really bloody ought to be.
I think they're thinking about it, but I think that what is practical and what is easy to achieve in the short term is there is a massive gulf between that and where Farage is, and where that gulf is where all the politics is. And I think clearly, again, actually in policy terms, genuinely, there is not going to be, there wouldn't be, if you put Reform and Farage in there tomorrow, I predict that in policy terms and actual deportations and changing the flow, certainly in the short term, there wouldn't be a great deal of difference, but there would be a great deal of difference on the politics. What would Farage be doing now if he were Prime Minister? He'd be opening up some camp somewhere and inviting all the television cameras in, and there'd be bunk beds and everything, and it'd look Spartan, and it'd be austere, and he'd be like, well, I'm sorry, this is what you get. If you come, this is what you get. And all this, and he'd throw his hands up in that pantomime way that he does. You know, and he'd do that, and he'd probably be briefing the papers. He's going to open a camp on, say, you know, Ascension Island or whatever it's going to be, and he'd go to Ascension Island, and it's, you know, and how much of this kind of translated would kind of be actually relatively immaterial, but it would dominate the politics. Whereas the government is doing nothing of that. It's earnestly trying to solve the problem. But unfortunately, and I don't like this, you and I might not like it, but it is true, earnestness doesn't get you very much in today's media environment. It was nonetheless interesting that, I mean, in terms of the sort of how the government are responding to it rhetorically, at Downing Street today at the lobby briefing, which has started again, they are actually basically refusing to demur or dissent from anything much that Farage has said. So Starmer, Prime Minister's spokesperson, saying that Starmer is open to striking returns deals with Afghanistan and Eritrea. We're not taking anything off the table. Starmer won't criticise Farage's rhetoric and claims that Britain is facing an invasion by migrants. They just say, we recognise the strength of feeling. They do rule out leaving the ECHR because, as we've discussed, it underpins the Good Friday Agreement. So, generally speaking, what Starmer is doing is saying Farage is right. The question then is, well, if you're saying Farage is right, why don't you just do what Farage is saying and suggesting? And that's very difficult politics. It's really difficult politics.
I get the impression that the real split in the Labour Party right now is between those who think that the main threat to them staying in power is Farage and the right, and you've got to be moving your politics in a direction of populist, anti-immigrant direction, and those who think that actually the Labour Party is really its existence is threatened by the Liberal Democrats, by the Green Party, by Corbyn's party that still to properly emerge, and that from the left is where your greatest challenge is, and to start going in the direction of Faragista politics is lunacy, and I get the sense that there's a slight paralysis in which way the government ought to go. So it borrows a bit from Farage, but then doesn't adopt the policies, and doesn't actually then either condemn the Farage politics either, and just kind of slightly frozen in the headlights by what is coming.
Yeah, and the problem is that Farage will always be able to outflank you. So
yes,
Farage knows that Starmer is never going to say should pull out the ECHR, partly because if Keir Starmer believes in anything, it is in the structures of international law, international treaties, international obligations. That is at the centre of his type of kind of cosmopolitan politics. So he's never going to do it. But also because actually just in government terms, it's just deeply impractical.
Yeah. Let's just bring in this question that we had. And I know it's not a special question and answer edition of the Newsagents, heaven forbid.
Could be.
Well, it could be, but it's not.
No.
But this is just a great question from Jay, who says, "Hi, Newsagents. Given the enactment of Operation Raise the Colours in mine and Lewis's birthplace, Rednall, Birmingham, and its slow spread across the nation, how would the Newsagents suggest Labour tackle the issue? Take them down and most likely take some heavy political flack, leave them up, not giving in to the bait offered by the groups putting them up?"
Well, Jay should just, of course, consider himself lucky that you haven't told him to off, which is the last thing that you did to the last question that we were asked by.
There were very particular circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting strategy, isn't it? Telling your own listeners to off. But hey, look, it seems to be working for us. So.
I did go home on the tube that day and think,
quite Farage-east, actually.
Was that a smart thing to have done? Anyway, to the question. Funnily enough, I was in Norfolk this weekend and was driving up the...
You and Rupert Lowe, sort of making sure that the dinghies didn't come over that way.
Exactly. I was there.
Yeah.
Kind of on the M11 and A14, and there were an awful lot of bridges where, the flag of St George was hanging, which you wouldn't normally see. Did I find it offensive? No, I don't find it offensive. Fine. I think people should, if people want to fly the flag, marvellous. Be proud of our country. If you travel in America, you'll see the Stars and Stripes absolutely bloody everywhere.
Yeah, I think in terms of the political strategy to how to handle it, I think Downing Street basically got it right today, where they said Starmer supports people putting up flags but won't comment directly on people hanging them from lampposts. The PM supports people putting up flags to show pride in our value and heritage. Look, we know why the groups who are behind at least some of this stuff, we know why they're doing it, right? They're doing it to try and get a reaction. In some cases, they're doing it to try and intimidate. Now, obviously, objectively speaking, there should be nothing intimidating about St. George's flag, the England flag. It should be the flag of our country. We do know, obviously, historically, that it has connotations on the far right, and the EDL have used it, and all of these sorts of things. So I do know that, and I'm a great believer in reclaiming both the British flag and the England flag. Other countries don't have this problem whatsoever or have this connotation, and we should seize it back. But I do understand why in certain places, because of that historical connotation and because of that motivation, some of these people are not doing it because they're motivated by patriotism. They want to intimidate. They want to send a message. They want to send a message of kind of cultural kind of aggression and all that sort of stuff. I can understand why some people might find it difficult or intimidating or a bit worrying or a sign of something. That said, we shouldn't allow them to do it. They want to put the flag up, fine. And we say that is the flag of England, that is the flag of Britain, that's the flag of Shakespeare, that's the flag of democratic values, that's a flag of liberalism, it's a flag of tolerance, and we welcome it. And I think that's the only way to deal with it, because if you don't deal with it that way, then what you do is you allow these malign forces to own that flag, a flag that most people, because they don't think about, they're not sitting there and thinking about some of those connotations. They just see and think that's the flag of my country. And if they hear left-wing forces or progressive forces of the government being a bit sniffy about it, then they think, oh, right, why don't they like our flag? So I think the easiest way to... And by the way, if the government do that and we all just go, yeah, put it up, they'll stop putting it up. Or at least those people will stop putting it up, because it will have lost all element of being subversive.
I think there has been a degree to which the flag has been reclaimed. You think of when it's the World Cup and England are playing in the World Cup and the flag of St George is bloody everywhere, and outside my house too, and fantastic. And if people want to hang a flag from gantries and lampposts, I mean, I kind of saw that councils are ordering taking them down because of the danger of the flags, and I'm thinking, oh, be careful how you're doing this, because honestly, if it looks like there are councils who are against the flag being flown, I can see the point of, you don't want people clambering up lampposts, falling off them, and then ending up in hospital. And so there is a safety issue about it. But, broadly speaking, if people want to fly the flag, fantastic. This is our country. We're proud to have our flag. We're proud to have the Union flag. We're proud to have the flag of St George. I think... If anyone on the left starts getting their knickers in a twist about it, they're making a huge mistake and doing the far right's work, and those who do want it to be seen as a sort of almost an intimidatory thing, saying we're British, we're English, we're white, this is our country, which is the undertone of why some people are doing this.
Yeah, it's like and there is a more historic thing as well about, which has always been the case. I mean, George Orwell famously wrote about this, right? About a certain middle-class intellectual type or left-wing intellectual thing in Britain, which is, it's the only country in the world where sort of middle-class intellectual voices are sniffy about their own patriotism and are perfectly comfortable with nationalism of other countries, but not so much their own. And I think that survives, right? That strand survives. And if there is that kind of sniffiness, then again, not only does it open up that space to say, and you see this, and these are videos about this sort of stuff all the time, it opens up that space about the English flag itself, but also then these people say, well, these councils don't have a problem when it's, I don't know, Pakistan Independence Day and they put up the Pakistani flag, or it's they put up the Jamaican flag, or whatever it happens to be. Now, whether these councils actually do that or not is by the by. That is what they sort of alight upon, right? And is a fragment of truth and a kernel of truth to this stuff. And it just gets projected out of all proportion. So I think half the job of progressive politics these days is not allowing the sort of chink of light to even be, that door to even become ajar, and just shutting it firmly in the face of these people.
Don't fall for it. Ignore it. Fly your own flag. Be proud of who we are, where we come from, and fly the flag of St George with pride.
Have you been Keir Starmer's political prisoner?
Absolutely. And me and several other people. Like I said, it's important to remember that it wasn't just me. He needs to practice what he preaches. I think, he's a human rights lawyer, so maybe he needs to look back at what people's human rights are, what freedom of speech means, and what the laws are in this country.
So that was Lucy Connolly speaking to Alison Pearson from the Daily Telegraph, who is of very like mind on this issue. That Lucy Connolly was a political prisoner, and she is now being almost sort of deified as this tortured soul who
Joan of Arc of our time.
Yeah, exactly. That there is something that was terribly wrong, and that she was a victim of the lack of free speech in this country for what she posted when the riots took place last summer. And it's just worth reminding ourselves what she did say, which was about burning down the hotels where asylum seekers were being held. And that was seen as the wrong side of the line by the courts, and she was imprisoned for it.
Yeah, she, during those riots, she tweeted, and she's a wife of an ex-Conservative councillor, she tweeted, "Mass deportation now, set fire to all the hotels full of the if that makes me racist, so be it." That was viewed over 300,000 times before being deleted. Then she was sentenced to 31 months in prison at Birmingham Crown Court for incitement to violence. She served about 40% of that, 10 months. She was released on the 21st of August, so 5 days or so ago. And this became a kind of cause célèbre on the online right. You know, this idea that she was a political prisoner, that she was being unfairly treated, that there was two-tier justice and all that sort of stuff. I mean, and I interviewed Tory frontbencher Matt Vickers on Sunday on RBC about this, and he agreed with this idea that she was a political prisoner, that she'd been treated unfairly, that there had been an unfair process. The idea that she was a political prisoner was on not just on some sort of fringe groups online. You know, it was on the front page of the Daily Telegraph this weekend. It was on the front page of the Sun this weekend, and I think this shows, again, the sort of deep radicalisation of much of what was once mainstream centre-right thought in this country. Look, you can have an argument, you can have a debate about whether or not Connolly's sentence was too harsh, that she shouldn't have got 31 months. In the end, she obviously served 10 months. But this idea that she was, the PM's political prisoner, the Prime Minister has nothing to do, and these people know this, nothing whatever to do with the personal sentencing of these people. He's completely removed from it. It was a judicial decision. This legislation under which she was sentenced was passed in the late 1980s. So if you want to blame anyone, blame Margaret Thatcher. And this idea that, you know, she had an unfair trial, she pleaded guilty. She said she was guilty in her own trial. So have an argument if you want about the severity of the sentence, but bear in mind that it is always true and always the case that people who affect disorder, and she was urging disorder, at a moment of mass disorder tend to be treated more harshly than they do at other times. Hence why other people who actually were going out rioting got more severe sentences than they might have done at other moments. And it was very, very severe invective and rhetoric that she was using.
Look, if we believe in the rule of law in this country and due process...
Which one would have thought the Tory party did.
Yeah, she had the rule of law. There is, as you say, a law on the statute books passed in the 1980s, which she pleaded guilty to having broken. She was duly sentenced in a court of law for that offence. And we're going to have Nigel Farage going over to give evidence to the House Justice Committee, run by this guy called Jim Jordan. And they would love it for Connolly to be able to go as well. Unfortunately, she can't because of the terms of her release from prison under licence. Also, she's got a criminal record, which doesn't normally help you get into the United States of America, but maybe they would waive it for her. But again, it's this idea that kind of America is the only place where free speech exists and Britain is trampling on it. I just don't think that bears any scrutiny at all. You look at who's scrubbing their phones when they're coming into Britain. Nobody. Look at the people who are really concerned about going into America right now, that their posts on whatever the issue, anti-Trump, pro-Hamas, I don't know, whatever, might stop them getting into the country.
There seems to be some confusion on the right between the difference of politically motivated speech and politically motivated justice. There is no doubt that her speech was politically motivated. There is no doubt that what she was saying was deeply tied to the politics of that particular moment. But she went beyond just politics. She advocated violence at a moment of national disorder when the threat of these hotels potentially being burned down was very, very real. How else should the state respond? How else should the state respond? And bear in mind as well that her appeal to reduce the sentence, it wasn't just this judge at Birmingham Crown Court. It went to the Court of Appeal in May 2025 and they ruled the sentence was not manifestly excessive. The state does tend to treat these things seriously. And I think political figures, again, it goes back to that conversation we had about Nigel Farage at the start. Politicians who aspire to power, who aspire to pull the levers of power in the state should be very, very careful about casting aspersions that somehow the state itself, our justice system, which actually generally is admired around the world for its fairness, our judiciary generally admired for being non-politically motivated, for not having politics in that element of the judiciary, should be quite careful about suggesting that somehow our judicial system is being used to go after people of a particular political persuasion. Because once that genie is out the bottle, once the population at large come to believe that, if they do, and I actually think this Lucy Connolly thing, most people out there have never heard of her, and it's an obsession of quite a small, committed online right group. But as soon as people start to believe that, that way lies ruin and danger, and it's very hard to undo it, as the United States itself has found.
And look at what's happening in the United States right now. I mean, John Bolton's home being raided by the FBI.
That is politically motivated judicial action.
That is purely
executive
politically
action.
motivated. That is the Justice Department under Donald Trump's orders going after his enemies. We don't have anything like that in this country. I'm sure there are going to be miscarriage of justice and there will be other things, but what happened to Lucy Connolly was none of the above.
And with that, we'll be back tomorrow.
We'll see you then.
We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.